Alright, so I figured we'd go over this particularly for Sybil who wasn't in class, but this might be a good way to kind of refresh on these as we progress in the process and on our own work, and particularly after the class is gone and done. So I'm going to go over Friday night's lecture, hopefully more briefly, but yeah, just hit the high points. So we covered what the 5 planes were. This is from J.J. Garrett, Jesse James Garrett, of The Elements of User Experience. The book and a link to it is in the Resources 1 folder on our Slack channel. So the first thing that we deal with as user experience designers, hopefully anyway, is strategy. A lot of people call this the why plane, as in why does the site exist or why does the product exist? And it's important to note that this goes for both the creator, the owner, the business, and the user. So this is where you would detail, hopefully, the goals of the user and the owner, what they need to get out of things, what do they expect, what does the business need in return, is it making and saving money, that sort of thing. So the next plane is the scope plane, as in the what plane, or what are we doing? This outlines all the features and functions that are going to help achieve those goals that we outlined in the strategy. So a lot of times this can be requirements and specs, which we'll talk about in the next little video. But really this is kind of a good question to ask, what can we realistically do? Because this will set good, attainable expectations that everybody can buy into. Also, by outlining the scope, you can prevent the dreaded scope creep, which is where more features get added and it becomes so robust that you're perpetually in beta. The launch date is always 2 months away, no matter what month it is or when you put the first launch date out there. So defining the scope kind of attacks all those problems before they can hopefully present themselves. The next plane is structure. And this is sometimes referred to as the how plane, although it has a lot of overlap with skeleton. So things like how much content is there, how much information do we need to present, how is it organized, how is it prioritized. This is where interaction design and information architecture, excuse me, happen. This is when they start to be developed. But really, it's a lot of more pragmatic questions. What are things going to be called? How are people going to move through it? Again, that structure step is shared rather with the skeleton step. This is where navigation and layout start to happen. So how are people going to move through things practically speaking? How is it going to be segmented? How will each screen be laid out and laid out in relation to other screens? You start to consider visual continuity, start to consider placement on the screen. This is where interface design and navigation design take place, which I'll talk about in a little bit, and how to differentiate between the two, even though it's there's probably more overlap than not. This is also where wireframing, if you're familiar with that, happens. So finally we have the surface plane. This is where the user interface and all things visual to aid that user come in. So this is the fonts, colors, stylings, animations, all that sort of stuff happens here. So within those, you can also divide these groups into subgroups. So on the left here we have task-based considerations that are usually linked to the interface. So if it's an app or a software-based system or a web app, those are going to be kind of the more interface specific questions. And then on the right here we have info-based considerations that are usually tied to the content. How much are we going to have, what's it going to entail, that sort of thing. Before we go on, it's kind of important to note that this is super segmented and seems really linear, but I think it's probably more appropriate to view it as a gradient, so from abstract to concrete. And it's also nice to point out now, even though we'll go over it a little more in detail later, that this is a pretty interdependent process. So sometimes you'll reveal things in the skeleton plane that makes you revisit, maybe even as far back as the scope. And like I said, there can be lots of shared information between, say, the skeleton and the structure plane. So it's a good thing to keep in mind that it's not necessarily as point A to point Z as it might seem here. So for the strategy plane, typically there isn't a lot of differentiation between the tasks and the info. It's still user needs and business objectives. And those can be identified and should be identified through user research, ethnography, technography, psychographics, that sort of thing. But really, you're determining the site objectives and all that out of there. The internally derived goals for the site, we'll say. So as we move into the scope plane, on the left here we have the tasks, and this is where we get into functional specifications, or the feature set. So this is detailed description of functionality the site must include in order to meet user needs. So what does it offer? What does it aim to do? And then on the right, in info, we have the content element required. So what amount of data, what information needs to get served up? And by defining that, we know what we're building for. So on to structure, we're concerned with the interaction design. So how does the system behave when somebody does something? When I click on a link, what happens? As we move on to the info side of things, we get into information architecture. And information architecture is basically the arrangement of information throughout the entire site. How is it organized? How is it structured? That sort of questions. So actually, let me go back here just a little bit. So as I mentioned, we'll get into the difference between these two, interaction design and information architecture. We'll also get into the difference between interaction design and interface design, which is usually the more confusing. As we get into interface design on the skeleton plane, this is where we deal with all the buttons, toolbars, controls, basically the things that allow us to interact with the functionality of the system. That's, in a nutshell, interface design. So interaction design means you decided that there are possibly three actions. There are three possible actions that a user could take. Interface design is going to helpfully tell the user which one is the most important through kind of placement, clues, prominence, those sort of things. And then within navigation design determines how easily and intuitively somebody moves through the system. And this is usually throughout the whole site. So what does or doesn't belong in that navigation menu, and why is navigation design as opposed to interface design. And it's also based on the previous groupings created in information architecture. So there is a strong link between navigation design and information architecture. Information architecture sometimes takes an entire snapshot of all the information on the site and will categorize it. Some people argue that that's a good practice. Some say that it needs to be kind of a rolling inventory. But in any case, it's going to subdivide things naturally, and navigation design capitalizes on that. So finally, we have the surface plane again, and this is where all the visual design takes place, and that is usually irrespective of whether it is task-based or an info-based system. So it's again, what colors, what fonts, how do those reinforce and support feedback, how does it support navigation, all the steps outlined below. So again, I mentioned that this was not a linear process, and some people describe it as a cyclical one. We looked at models in class that actually do describe it as a cyclical one. You look at kind of lean UX or agile UX. Those tend to consider a feedback loop more heavily. I think this is a good way to interact with it, but it is really important to note that there is a large degree of overlap. They're totally independent. There's nothing that says that once you get to the skeleton, you couldn't conceivably return to strategy. Hopefully, you've taken strategy seriously enough to build a robust foundation so that when you get to skeleton, that's not necessarily needed. But it's better to go back than to ignore it and press on. So hopefully this clears up and refreshes your memory on some of the things that may not have been as noticeable in class. And if you weren't in class, hopefully it catches you up. Thanks for watching. Let me know if you have any questions.